Hello, friends. We are now at our final week of our study of the book of Acts together. This is a profoundly uncertain time between the pandemic, our political crises, the environmental crisis we're facing, the racial justice questions we face. I feel like this is a moment when the future is unclear. As we think about the pandemic, we know that these vaccines are coming, these new treatments, so there's hope for our future. But it's a future that still seems in the distance, far away. And how we get from here to there seems hard to imagine. I think it's that kind of uncertainty about what the future holds and what's next that our text today is calling us into. And what the text, I think, is helping us to imagine is the surprising ways that God is often acting in our midst. The way that God's activity, way that where God chooses to call home, that's often a surprise for us. And a lot of us, we don't like surprises. We don't like it when things don't go the way we expect. So part of the imagination that I think needs to be nurtured here is a sense of expectation about the surprising ways that God is going to act. That when God surprises us, when God shows up in places we didn't expect God to show up, when God moves in ways we didn't expect God to move, is there a way that we might move from hopelessness and anxiety in the face of that surprise to delight and expectation about God, what God will do? I don't know about you, but that's a word I need to hear in these days of uncertainty. Thanks for these last few weeks of work together. I look forward to hearing much more about the way that God is moving in your midst. Thank you, friends. Hello, friends, and welcome to the last session of our work together reading the book of Acts and seeing there what imaginations these texts, these stories ignite for us in our faith lives. Our last imagination in this session is that God moves far ahead of us, that God moves far ahead of us. The idea being here that there are ways in which in the book of Acts, it's kind of this recurring theme throughout the text, the ways that God moves far ahead of the early church, far ahead of its leaders, far ahead of us doing things that we can't anticipate, transforming the world in ways that we can't always predict, but that God is always moving far ahead of us, always bringing God's grace wherever God shows up. So to think about this text, I want to take us to Acts chapter 10. Now, the story in Acts chapter 10 is the story of Peter and Cornelius. Sometimes it's called the story of the conversion of Cornelius. But as we know, if we read that story, what you'll notice is that Cornelius, from the beginning of that story to the end of the story, doesn't change that much. But who does change is Peter, and also the church that is gathering around following Jesus in these early days of the church. It's Peter and the church that change most. It's this unexpected moment of conversion for this early group of believers. So again, Acts chapter 10, it's a really long story, and it's one that Luke kind of slows down to tell. It's one that Luke will retell 2 other times later on in the narrative. And you'll notice if you read chapter 10, you'll notice that there's a lot of repetition about different parts of this story. So we'll dip in and out here and there of different parts of the story, but I really encourage you to go back and read all of Acts chapter 10 to kind of catch the panoply of this really fantastic story. So the story starts at the beginning of chapter 10, verse 1. It starts by saying that in Caesarea, there was a man named Cornelius, a centurion of the Italian cohort, as it was called. He was a devout man who feared God with all his household. He gave alms generously to the people and prayed constantly to God. So when we first meet Cornelius, we might imagine that a first century audience might be initially a bit suspicious of somebody like Cornelius. He represents Roman power. His job is basically to pacify an area of the empire. And the way that you pacify with an army is with the threat of violence, with the threat of death. But if we've been paying attention in the story that Luke is telling us from the gospel down to Acts, Cornelius is not the first centurion that we meet. There's another centurion in the Gospel of Luke that Jesus meets, a centurion that Jesus lifts up as his example of faithfulness, which is a bit of probably a shocking experience for Luke's first audience, that it's a centurion, this representative of Roman power, that's lifted up as an example of faithfulness. So in that way, Luke is already preparing us to encounter this Cornelius that at first glimpse we might think it's a bad guy, but it turns out as we keep reading that he was a devout man, he feared God, and we learn soon after this too that Cornelius's prayers have ascended to God as well. So he's not just somebody who prays, but someone whose prayers God hears. So Cornelius, we learn, has this vision. It's a vision that only has to happen once for Cornelius to understand what is being asked of him. A vision from heaven tells him to go send for Peter, and he does. The story then continues. It's this very interesting way that the story kind of focuses in on Cornelius and then is going to now focus us in on Peter's part of the story. So later on in chapter 10, it says, about noon the next day, as they were on their journey. So these are Cornelius's men. As they're coming to see Peter, they're approaching the city. Peter went up on the roof to pray. So it's almost cinematic the way that Luke is writing this story. Cornelius has his vision, sends his men to go get Peter. And as they're approaching, Peter's going up to the roof to pray. We read also that he's becomes hungry. He's waiting to eat. And now it's Peter's turn to have a vision. Peter's vision is a bit different than Cornelius's vision. Peter's vision involves a sheet coming down from the heavens full of all kinds of animals. The sheet comes down 3 times. A voice from heaven 3 times tells Peter to kill and eat. And 3 times Peter says, I've never done such a thing. I do not eat unclean animals. This doesn't make any sense. When Peter emerges from his vision, he doesn't quite know what it means. It's not clear to him what the vision is about. But right about that same time, Cornelius's men show up, and Peter invites them in. They stay together, and then Peter goes with them to Cornelius's house. Again, if you read chapter 10, what you'll notice is that I think in Peter's mind, there's still some hesitation along the way. He's not quite sure what this means. He's not quite sure he should be there. When he shows up at Cornelius's house, the first thing that Cornelius does is totally Gentile out and try to worship Peter. It must be confirming all of Peter's worst fears about what it means to be around these Gentiles. He shows up and they try to worship him from the very moment he steps into the house. But Peter says, stand up, I'm only a mortal. It turns out Cornelius had invited his friends, his family, his servants, his neighbors, his buddies. They're all gathered in the house, and Peter walks in. All these people are in this house, and the first thing that Peter says is, I'm not supposed to be here. We're not supposed to be gathering together like this. But tell me why you've called for me. Cornelius shares the vision that he had, and Peter, I think, then starts to get it. He starts to get it. It says later on in the text that Peter began to speak to them, began to speak to all those who were gathered there by Cornelius. I truly understand that God shows no partiality, but in every nation, anyone who fears God and does what is right is acceptable to God. So notice what happens here is that Peter starts to get it. God shows no partiality. And instead, wherever people come from, wherever they've been born, whatever their ethnicity, whatever their background, God is ready to embrace whoever you are. If you're willing to follow God, if you do what is right and acceptable to God, if you draw near to God, God will draw near to you. That perhaps the boundaries of God's grace are wide and they're porous and they're ever expanding. Peter gets it. Peter gets it. God's grace was maybe bigger than I had imagined. But in some ways, I wonder if Peter is still unsure about what he's experiencing. He's still wondering what this all might mean. And the reason I think this is that I know when I get nervous, I just start preaching sometimes. And I think Peter does the same thing here. Again, if you go back and look at chapter 10, right after Peter begins to speak, he just keeps on preaching and preaching and preaching. And he keeps on preaching, I think, because he's a little uncomfortable about what he's experiencing. He doesn't quite know what to make of this moment in front of him. And then in one of my favorite little texts from Acts is right at the end, Right after Peter is preaching, Luke writes this: while Peter was still speaking, while he was still speaking, the Holy Spirit fell upon all who heard the word. While Peter was still speaking, while he was still preaching, while he was still trying to talk his way into understanding what was happening, while he was speaking, while he was preaching, the Holy Spirit fell upon all who heard the word. I love this, right? As Peter is trying to make sense of what he's experiencing and what he's seeing, he's trying to figure out what this all means. The Holy Spirit just says, enough, Peter. Enough with your preaching, enough with your worries, enough with your anxieties. I'm just going to show up. And the Holy Spirit falls upon all who heard the word, with no exception. And here I'm struck, because we know Cornelius is someone who's deeply faithful. We know Cornelius is someone whose prayers have ascended to God. But what about his family? What about his servant and his neighbors? Were they as faithful as Cornelius was? Apparently, in this moment, that doesn't matter much. What matters is not Cornelius' faithfulness or the faithfulness of his neighbors. What matters here is God's activity. What matters here is God's initiative. What matters here is God's grace. The Holy Spirit fell upon all who heard the word. Without them asking for it, without them really looking for it, they just showed up for it because Cornelius invited them over. The Holy Spirit falls where the Holy Spirit chooses to fall. And here the Holy Spirit falls upon all who heard the word. I think in some ways this is God interceding and saying, Peter, enough with the words, enough with the talking, enough with the preaching. Let me show you the shape of grace that I've been talking about for all these years. The story goes on. The circumcised believers who had come with Peter were astounded that the gift of the Holy Spirit had been poured out even on the Gentiles, for they heard them speaking in tongues and extolling God. And here I want to be so frustrated with Peter's companions. I mean, I want to be like, were you not paying any attention at all? Were you not paying attention when in the opening chapters, or in the opening chapter of Acts, Jesus commands the disciples to be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, and Samaria, and to the ends of the earth? Who did you think you'd find out there in the world except a bunch of dirty Gentiles? Or think back, all the way back to the beginning of Genesis, when God creates the world and calls the whole world good. Did you not notice that? Did you not notice God calling the whole world good? Or when God calls Abraham to be a blessing to the nations, to the whole world, to the Gentiles, to the Jews, to everybody? Were you not listening? Or when Isaiah is imagining the world coming to worship together and worshiping the one true God in the mountain, that God calls all these people and they're worshiping together. Did you not listen? Did you not hear? Or at the beginning of the Gospel of Luke, when Simeon and Mary are singing all these songs so it looks like a Broadway musical, were you not listening to them when Simeon says that Jesus is going to be a light to the Gentiles, a light to the nations? Weren't you listening? Weren't you paying attention? I want to be frustrated with them. But if I'm honest, perhaps I'm not that different than they were. Because when God's grace falls upon people who I don't think are particularly deserving of God's grace, when God's grace pours down upon communities that aren't like mine, when God's grace dawns upon communities who see the world very differently than I do, I sometimes get astounded too and wonder what in the world God is up to. What might this all mean? What are you doing, God? This doesn't make any sense. I'm more like them in this position than I think we care to admit. And notice what convinces them and what might convince us of the wideness of God's grace. It's that they heard them speaking in tongues and extolling God. They saw visible, tangible evidence of the presence of God's Spirit. They saw visible, tangible evidence of God's grace. And when that happens, we dare not question if God is present in these places or not. It goes on. Then Peter said, "Can anyone withhold the water for baptizing these people who have received the Holy Spirit, just as we have?" Here, this question reminds me of the question that the Ethiopian eunuch asked last week. What is to prevent me from being baptized? And here Peter says, can anyone withhold the water for baptizing these people? It's a question about the wideness of God's grace. What is to prevent me from being baptized? Can anyone withhold the water for baptizing these people? How big are we actually saying God's grace is? And I think these two questions connect in a very interesting way. Here, Cornelius and his family and his friends are going to be baptized. And this moment is going to become a controversy that starts here in chapter 10 and continues all the way to chapter 15. In chapter 15, there will be a big apostolic council. People will figure out what's going on. I like to joke sometimes that something new and different that we didn't expect happens in chapter 10. And therefore, the church reacts like the church often does to form a committee to figure out what God is doing. It takes them a while to get there all the way to chapter 15. There's lots of back and forth. I'm struck how often God is moving so far ahead of us, doing things we didn't anticipate. And that we're always playing catch up to figure out what God has done in the past, rather than in the moment noticing the wonders of God's grace. But again, that connection back to the Ethiopian eunuch stories is striking, because if the Ethiopian eunuch is a Gentile, then Cornelius and his family were not the first Gentiles baptized. It happened already in chapter 8, but the church didn't notice. Again, because it wasn't Peter or Paul, it wasn't one of the stars of the book of Acts, but just Philip. And it happened in this deserted road. I wonder how often things are happening in our communities and in our churches. Radical things that God is up to, but they're happening in places that we don't notice, that we don't see. And again, we're playing catch up with what God is up to, because if the Ethiopian eunuch was a Gentile, then all the controversies around Cornelius and his household aren't that big a deal, because God has already spoken before. If we just had the eyes to see and the ears to hear what God was up to in the world. Can anyone withhold the water for baptizing these people who have received the Holy Spirit just as we have? I think one thing that Peter notices here is that vision he had earlier, that vision with the blanket and the animals on it, that vision wasn't about food. It was about people. And if God has called a people clean, if the Spirit is present among a people, if the movement of God's grace is evident, then we have lost the right to call a people unclean. To modernize that a bit, we have lost the right to say those people don't belong. Those people are not aligned with God. Those people are not a part of God's community. We have lost all right to do that when the evidence of God's grace is so evident, so vibrant, and so real. The imagination this week is that God moves far ahead of us. And I wonder what new things God is doing right now. New things, new ways to nurture a church that we can't quite imagine, to call leaders that we wouldn't have seen as qualified before, but that God is doing a new and extravagant thing. And maybe it's better said that it's a new thing to us, but it's never been a new thing to God. This is the business that God is in. God is in the business of delighting us with surprise over and over again. God moves far ahead of us. So a handful of questions that we might pursue together with some friends, some family, maybe over a Zoom call. Number one, when has God moved far ahead of you in your life? Tell a story about when that has happened to you. Number two, in what ways might God be breaking open your understanding of the shape of community, about who belongs? In what ways might these stories open up possibilities for how we think about who we are, who that we is, and how big that community is? And number three, what imaginations from Acts are sticking with you these weeks? What imaginations from Acts do you need most in this moment? And these might be imaginations that we talked about during this time together, or maybe your own imaginations that have emerged as you've read these texts with friends and family or Bible study group. What imaginations are sticking with you these weeks? And which ones do you need most? What kind of imagination do you need in order to be the faithful person that God has called you to be in these strange, strange moments? To get us started, one last imagination. So we made our way from Acts chapter 1 now to Acts chapter 10. There's a lot more great stories, but alas, we're out of time. But I wanted to leave you with one last imagination, an imagination that has us go to the very end of the book of Acts. The very end of the book of Acts, Paul is imprisoned. He's in Rome. He's awaiting his execution. But Luke does not narrate his execution. Instead, the last thing we hear about is that Paul is, yes, imprisoned, but he's preaching the gospel. And the last word in the book of Acts, surprisingly, is one Greek word that we might translate unhindered. He's preaching the gospel unhindered, without restraint. What a strange way to end this book. We know Paul is headed toward his death, and yet the last picture we see of him is not of him dying, but of him preaching the gospel unhindered, without restraint. It makes me wonder if perhaps the end of Acts is not the end of Acts. That last chapter, chapter 28, is not the last chapter of this story. The story that Luke begins telling with Elizabeth and Zechariah and Mary and Joseph in Luke chapter 1, all the way through Paul's imprisonment in Rome, that's just the beginning of the story. A story that's still unfolding among us today. What if we are now part of this story, part of this dynamic story of the ways that God moves, the ways that God surprises, the way that God's grace pours over all of us? What if the end of Acts is not the end of Acts, but we are still a part of this story? Thank you so much for these weeks spent together studying this text. I hope this time has been a blessing to you, and I look forward to hearing about all the ways that you are learning from these texts and seeing new imaginations in this world. Thank you, friends.